Hi and welcome to my SwiftUI course. I think you're gonna enjoy this one. So this is the app that we're going to learn how to build, and it's so much more developed than last time. We're going to start very slowly with basic layouts, and then I'm gonna show you animations, gestures. As you can see here, we're using a lot of gesture so that you can create any custom interface that you want. And along the way, you're gonna learn a lot about design practices, the best techniques for creating beautiful animations that really brings the experience together. And we're using techniques that are not often taught, such as the blur, for example. You can see there's a background blur with different thickness of this sheet. And then we have the animation for the Apple Watch rings, and then we have the structure of the layout itself. So how do you create conditions so that you can drag and drop at different points in your UI, and having the screen that sits on top of every single thing. And here you're gonna see this beautiful transition that is totally custom made. And you can see I'm detecting the drag progress in order to create this transformation, the coloring and the blur and the background. And when you complete, it goes back seamlessly to its initial position. And on top of that, it works with scroll. So you can see here, regardless of the position, it works perfectly. And then all of this data is coming from a CMS. So we are actually making an API call to receive all of this content. So it's all dynamic. It's going to allow you to create an app with dynamic data and take it to the App Store, including the login itself. And here on this login screen, I'm going to drag to create this beautiful 3D parallax effect. And when I release, it just comes back. It's really beautiful. And we also have the keyboard interactions. And when the user log in, it makes an API call to Firebase, and then it's going to log you, it's going to save your state so that the user is logged in, and when I press here, it goes to a different place. Now it's going to this menu that comes from the bottom, and I can just drag to create more 3D animation in the back here, and it's all happening using a background that is shared across multiple screens. And that's really the magic of SwiftUI. It allows you to create so many different kinds of transitions and views that sit on top of each other. And even those that use really heavy animations, such as a lot of animations, as you can see in the login screen, well, you're able to use an if statement to bring more views on top. And so when you have heavy screens like this one that has its own scrolling, its own dynamic content or animations, it's just using an if statement to bring it up so that we always have the best performance. Now we're also going to learn how to create these built-in controls, such as the navigation view here. And here we're using a list layout, so you can just go back and forth between these screens. So we're passing the data and then coming back. And then we're also going to learn how to use combine to add new data, as well as editing the data by removing or by rearranging that data. And these controls, believe it or not, are just a few lines of code. And we can just dismiss it like this. And that's the type of stuff that's really useful when you don't want to think too hard about creating something custom. So we're also going to look at the context menu, the tab bar, the share sheets, all of these things that only take a few lines of code, and you don't have to reinvent the wheels for them. But otherwise, this course is really more focused on custom UIs, such as this one using 3D transformation as you scroll, and we're using the geometry reader for that. And all of the UI that we're creating, even though they're custom, it's fully adapted to the bigger iPhones or the smaller iPhones, and of course the iPad. And here we're actually making sure that it fits the bigger screen. So for example, you can see that the text here has a maximum width so that it remains readable. And we made sure that every single layout can be adapted for the iPad. So the login screen, the animations are centered, and everything should be seamless, including the modal presentation, as well as adapting the layout for the cards here. And we're gonna use a different animation. As you can see, it looks more like the wallet app, and I think that's pretty cool. Now keep in mind that everything that we learn here can be fully customized. So if you don't want to have this animation, you want to have a different type of animation with different values, and you want to have different transformations, blur, and effects, then you can do so by using the same techniques that I'm showing you, and even starting from this specific template and just have fun with it. And the great thing about SwiftUI is that you can totally use this for prototyping or for building your app to publish it. And you have the most native tools to create and adapt your UI, such as for dark mode. So we're gonna click here to switch to dark mode and jump back to our app. And here you can see it's completely seamless, and every single screen is using the dark mode scheme. So now you can see that even this image just adapted to dark mode. These colors were adapted to dark mode, and the sheets, as well as the blur, the animations, the text, and the layout, and it's just seamless. So even the animation here works perfectly. And this is really expected from your users because dark mode in iOS 13 is the big new feature, and we are going to be prepared for that. So let's take a look at Xcode and how it works, why SwiftUI is so special. First of all, you have this beautiful preview. So anytime that you change something in your UI, you're going to be able to preview here, and it's going to show in real time all the changes. On top of that, you can see the animations as you play the app right from Xcode. So just like the iOS simulator, I'm able to test all the animations, such as this custom transition. And if I want to change any content, I have all of these views that I can create the content and preview for that specific view. So if I jump, let's say, to the update list, I can just build specifically for that screen. Let's also take a look at the files. Now we have a bunch of screens, but we also have components. So for example, if you want to only see the ring view, which is a component for the Apple Watch-like rings, you can do so. You can customize the properties, and you're going to be able to, let's say if I change to 30% and resume the preview, it's going to automatically update. And whatever is using the ring view, so for example, from the home view, I'm gonna look for whatever is using the ring view, and I can just pass these color literals, which allows you to have these embedded colors, and I can change these double colors. So for example, like this one, I'm going to change to a blue instead. And when I do that, it changed automatically in the preview. And the same for the percentage. It's all doing that live. So data can be customized, and we have, let's say, this data right here. And every time that I change this data is going to be reflected in the preview. I have color literals, but as well, we have image literals. If I want to change this logo and resume, it's going to change my UI as a result. And I can even make API calls using a JSON format, such as this one, or a Contentful API, which is a CMS. And you can see here that the data from the last 4 cards are actually from the CMS. So if I click play here, I'm going to scroll down. You can see CMS with Contentful. And now if I decide to change this to add a number 2 and I publish it, go back to my Xcode, stop, and then play, you're gonna see that the content gets updated automatically from that CMS. So in this course, we're not just gonna learn how to create fake data. We're actually going to learn how to use a real API, taking a live data that can create a prototype or a full app that can be published to the App Store. We're gonna use Swift packages such as web images so that we can load images using URLs, or Lottie animations such as for this success view, and it's using animated assets from shape.so so that you don't have to recreate these animations from scratch in code, and your designer can just use After Effects to create them. I made sure that this course can be followed by anyone of any skill level, either designers or developers, as long as you are interested in the UI aspect of creating an app in SwiftUI, because we're going to learn about animations, we're going to learn about the best practices for iOS 13 design. We're going to take it all the way to the App Store. So I hope you're excited. You're going to need Xcode 11 as well as macOS Catalina. Make sure that you have downloaded the source files, and you're going to find the assets. So we can just drag and drop this to Xcode, as well as the source file, which allows you to inspect the code against your own progress. And this is especially important whenever there's a change to the code, which shouldn't happen in the early stage of the course, but you never know. But I would say that SwiftUI has been a lot more stable since Xcode 11 went public. But in general, whenever you run into an issue, it's important to check the text content where you have the code, but also the source files so that you can see what may have changed. For pro users, you have our support channel. You can ask questions whenever you have issues with this course. But otherwise, let's get started. I think you're gonna have a lot of fun. I'll see you in the next session. Hey there, and welcome back to the second session of my SwiftUI course. In this one, we're going to learn about layout and stacks and how to get started with Xcode. First of all, we're going to create a new Xcode project, and here we're going to select single view app, and then we're going to name this one design code, or whatever name you want for your app. The theme, you can set it to none for now, but essentially this is going to allow you to test on your device, but that's not important for now. For the organization identifier, it's going to be your domain name in reverse. For me, it's going to be designcode.io, so written in reverse, so io.designcode. The language is Swift, and the user interface SwiftUI. We're going to go to next, and then save that to desktop or downloads. This is going to create our first SwiftUI project. I'm going to maximize this by double-clicking here. And then we can go and find the assets that we have downloaded for this course. You're going to find the sketch file, the Lottie files, the source files, the URL images, as well as the assets for your app. So go to the assets folder, and we're going to start with the app icon. I'm going to go to the assets catalog first, and we're going to select the app icon, select all of this by doing Command A, and drag and drop all of these images right here. Now it's going to have a bunch of misplaced images. We just need to figure out where to put them. First of all, 76 at 2x is going to be right here. 76 at 2x, 76 at 1x, and then 83.5, that is for the iPad Pro 12.9, and finally the icon for the App Store. The rest is not as important, therefore iPad notification settings and Spotlight, feel free to add them later on. For now, we're just going to delete these, and we shouldn't have any warning anymore. Then, going back to our assets, we can just select the rest of the images, including the folder for colors, and just drag and drop this to the navigator in the assets catalog, and you can see that since we're using PDF format, it only needs the 1x, so it's completely vector and it's scalable. What is interesting is that now you have color assets. And here you want to organize your colors based on light and dark mode. So now we have colors that have any appearance as well as dark appearance. And for each of these colors, you can use the sRGB value with a hexadecimal code. This is really useful for someone who designs in Sketch or Figma because we often use the hex value and you can just copy and paste this value right here. So for all of these colors, some of them don't need to be in dark mode, but I think later on, as you adapt this for dark mode, it is important to do it through the assets catalog instead of doing it in code, which can be a lot harder to do. But don't worry for now, because I set it up for you and I will explain a lot more in detail later as we deal with this issue. So now let's go to the content view, and this is where we're gonna start creating our first screen. The first thing is to be able to hide the left navigator as well as the inspector to completely focus on building our UI right here. And you can just resume, and here you're gonna be able to see the preview of your code on the left. And voila, this is what we see, and we can start building now. So in SwiftUI, anytime that you make a change to your code, it gets reflected in real time to your preview. So I'm going to type UI design, and it's going to show me the change right here. And on top of that, you can click in the preview to see what's going on. So for example, you could do command click here, and you can check the inspector, or you have a bunch of really useful functions here that I'm going to explain later. But let's click on SwiftUI Inspector, and I can change the font for the dynamic type right here. What is dynamic type? It allows you to set a font size that is preset by Xcode or by the conventions in iOS 13, and then it's going to automatically adjust the size based on accessibility options. So for someone who wants larger fonts, it's going to adapt automatically to that. So let's start with title, and you can see it's adding a modifier to your code that is a text component, and it's perfectly reflected between the preview and the code itself. And if I command click again, I can go to inspector, I can change the font weight as well to, let's say, semi-bold, and again, it does the two at the same time. Now, what happens if I want to set a second line of text? Here's the magic. I can just do Shift, Command, and L to bring this insert menu. And by the way, you can also click here on the plus sign, and this is kind of like the insert in Sketch or Figma, where you have a bunch of controls such as a button, a list, and a scroll view, or a modifier which allows you to style and add a bunch of properties and animations and whatnot to your controls. So let's say I want to add a second text. I can search for text in the view library, and I can just drag and drop directly to the preview. And I can choose to drop it at any side, top, right, left, or bottom. And if I do bottom, for example, it's going to automatically add a stack for me. What is a stack? Well, basically, this is kind of like Flexbox in CSS, where you can put a bunch of elements together, space them evenly against each other, align them against each other as well. And you can notice that by default, every single UI element is being centered in SwiftUI, and that ensures that it will adapt to any device by default. Every other platform like CSS or Swift always start from the top left, which is really hard to make it adaptive using a minimal amount of coding. Here in SwiftUI, it centers, so you don't need to change much because most content needs to be centered anyways. For the second line of text, I'm going to command click, go to the inspector, and for the color, I also have access to a bunch of preset colors or the colors that I have in my assets catalog, which is really useful. So I'm going to select, let's say, accent. Now you can see that I'm using a modifier called foreground color with the color called accent. But you can imagine that if we have a lot of UI elements or views on top of views, this is going to be really hard to command click, such as for the VStack, for example. Well, you can command click in the code, which is actually my preferred way, is to directly command click here and access the inspector from here instead. And here I can change the alignment so I can align both texts to the left against each other. So let's click here and voila, we have aligned the text. For the text itself, I can just double click and then change the text to certificate. Now let's take a look at the UI that we want to recreate. This is the sketch file, and we have two texts here, which is using a VStack, and then we have this logo here on the right side. So we're gonna have to use an H stack. So a VStack is a vertical stack and an H stack is a horizontal stack. And we can do so in the preview as well. So here I can do Command Shift and L, and instead of searching for an image control, I can just go to the images tab and then drag and drop the logo 1. And I can drag and drop to the right to create an H stack on top of the V stack. So as I mentioned earlier, by default, everything is taking the minimum size, but you can also take the maximum size if you use something called a spacer. So in between the V stack and the image, I can push everything in between so that it pushes this to the left and the logo to the right using the full width. So let me search for a spacer in the views, and then I can just double click here and it's going to add my spacer, which pushes all of the elements, and it's going to ensure that we're taking the full width because we're inside the H stack. Now I'm going to bring another image, Command Shift L, go to images. I'm going to get the card one and drag and drop that underneath. So it's going to create another VStack as a parent for me. So again, we have the first VStack, which contains the two titles, and then we have a logo with a spacer in between so that we can push everything to take the full width. And then we have another VStack which combines the H stack plus the image. I can also decide to add a spacer. So spacer parentheses. And if I do that, you're gonna see that it's pushing everything to take the full height of whatever device that you have. Now you can imagine that my card is getting a little bit too big. So what you can do here is that you can set the frame size for this card so that you can restrain it to a fixed width and height. So I'm going to command click the VStack and go to the inspector. In the inspector, I can change the frame width to, let's say, 340 and then 220. Press enter. If you press enter, you're gonna see the frame modifier added to the VStack. So now we're ensuring that the content is trying to sit inside that frame. Now, because this image is too big, and the way that SwiftUI works with the image is that it's going to take the actual size at 1x of the image and it's going to put it as is. But since it's too big for the frame, I'm going to make sure that this image is a little bit more adaptive. So what I can do for the image is to use a modifier. So Command Shift L to go to modifier, search for resizable, and this is going to make sure that it adapts to the frame. So if I select the frame, you can see that it fits perfectly now. But the problem is my image is now weird. It does not have the correct aspect ratio. So I'm gonna have to add a new modifier called aspect ratio and set it to either fill or fit. And this is very similar to what you find in the design tool. And I can set it to fill or fit. If you want to change this option directly in the code, which is again the preferred way, you can just delete the text itself and the dot, press dot, and you're gonna find a bunch of options that comes with this property. So you can see here I have either fill or fit. I'm going to select fit so that it fits within the frame of the card. Let's take a look at the card itself. Now we have a frame and we want to add a background color. So let's try background modifier, and by default it's going to be blue. We're going to keep it blue for now so that we can see what's going on. If I put black, the text is going to be not visible. And we're also going to add a corner radius. So corner radius, we're going to set it to 20. And what is interesting about the corner radius is that it's going to clip the content. You can already see the text being clipped by the card, which was not doing that before. And let's say I was to put this to fill, and you don't have to follow me here. You can see that the content does not go beyond the frame of the card, and that's because of the corner radius. So I'm going to put back to fit, and I'm going to set a shadow. So in order to set a shadow, again, it's a modifier, and this shadow is going to be 20. So that's it. This is my card. All that's left is to add some padding. Padding is a modifier as well. So you can decide to add a padding to your text, to a V stack, to H stack, wherever you want. In this case, I could have done it to the frame, but if I do it, it's going to push the image as well, and I don't want that. So I'm going to use the H stack instead. So let me select the H stack, press enter, dot padding. But here you can see that the autocompletion is really good in Xcode, and I definitely suggest to use autocompletion all the time because they are very long words, long properties. It's going to give you so much documentation about any given thing. So you can search for any modifier that you want, such as frame or padding or color, and it's going to try and find it for you. In this case, I'm going to use padding parentheses, and it's going to add that padding for me against the H stack. What you're noticing here is that SwiftUI has very good default values. Whenever you set a padding, you can see that without entering anything, it's giving me a default recommended padding of 16. And that applies automatically to every side. If I want to have a custom value, I can put 20, and it's going to apply 20 to every side. Now, what happens if I only want to set it to top, left, and right? Well, what I can do is before 20, I can do dot horizontal, comma, and then 20. So this will apply left and right, but not top and bottom. As you can imagine, this can also be vertical for top and bottom. And if you only want to set to top, I can add another one, dot padding, parentheses, dot top, comma, 20. So this will add 20 top, 20 left, and 20 right because of horizontal. Now let me set the actual colors from the design. So for example, I'm going to set the background to black instead of blue. And as a result, I'm going to have to set the title to white. And for the text color, is going to be a foreground color property. And I'm going to set that to white. And then we can change the background right here. So let me take a look. I want to set this image to be clipped and to take the full width almost of the card. And so what I can do here is to set it to fill instead. And it's going to center all the content, which means that this is taking too much physical space. So what I can do instead is to use a frame modifier and set it to a constraint width and height of 300 by 1110. But what is interesting here is that the content within the frame is centered, and we don't want that. So what's really cool is that I can add comma, alignment, and set it to top instead. So using this technique, you can imagine that we can use any image and set that almost like a background and position that the way that we want. So far, we've learned how to stack layout horizontally or vertically within a frame or taking the full space. But what I haven't shown you is how to pile in a 3-dimension different layers. So for example, if I want a card that is at the back of this card, how would I do it? The answer is the Z stack. So we have 3 types of stacks: H, V, and then Z. Z would be 3-dimensionally. Here I want to add a parent container, and there's one really cool way to do it is by command clicking VStack and do embed in VStack. And this is going to do the work for me, meaning that it's going to automatically wrap this content inside a VStack. And I can just change from VStack to ZStack and make sure that this is case sensitive, meaning that a normal lowercase z wouldn't work, but a capital Z will work. And this is generally the same in coding, and it's all case sensitive. So what I'm gonna do here is put a layer underneath this card, and this card being the entire VStack that has a frame. I can of course start with a text, but I can also start with a spacer and put the spacer inside a VStack. And using that VStack, I can just set my properties for the card. And in this case, we're gonna start with the frame as a modifier and set it to 300 by 220. And another property for the background. Blue is gonna be fine. And then the corner radius, which is going to be 20 as well. And finally, the shadow, which is going to be 20. So you can see here from the outline, just like in Sketch or Figma, whenever you select something, this is our background card. And it's not showing anything, that's because it's centered, it's using the same height. But what we can do is use a property called offset to move it. So this one, shape modifier, offset, to move it by the X position or the Y position. And in this case, I can just set it to X0, Y minus 20. And this is going to simply move my card by 20 to the top. So I have my VStack here with a spacer, which allows me to, later on, if I want to have some content like this card. But for now, it's just gonna be a plain background color. And I have my foreground card that has a bunch of content, images, H-stack and V-stack. And then the whole thing is inside a Z-stack so that they can pile on top of each other in a 3-dimensional way. But as you can imagine, the code can get a little bit heavy. We can have a lot of layers on top of each other. So one thing I can suggest is to create components. So we can reuse them many times across your app, and we can apply different modifiers on top of those components, and that will keep your code clean. And we're also going to learn how to add a bunch of effects that comes with SwiftUI, such as blending mode, blur, 3D transformation, and a lot of really cool stuff. I hope to teach you that in the next session. Hi, and welcome back to a third video for the SwiftUI course. So in this section, we're going to learn how to create components so that they're reusable, and also we're going to learn a bunch of effects such as scale, rotation, 3D, blend modes, changing colors, and so on. The first thing is we're going to create components, and here we have a giant one, which is the main front card. So what we're going to do here is to command click the VStack, and there will be an option called Extract Subview. Now, please note that this will only show if you have a parent container, which is a Z-stack. If it's on its own without a parent container, you won't be able to create a component. So I'm going to click on Extract Subview, and here it's going to automatically put all the code in its own space, and it's going to allow me to set the name for that. And I'm going to set it to card view, like this. It's also important to note that every time that I change components or data or variables, it's going to pause the preview, and I'm going to have to manually resume every single time. But whenever I'm inside this space here and I may change, it's not gonna pause things. So going back up, I'm going to click on the back card, command click it, extract subview. I'm going to name it back card view, like this. Now I'm going to resume again because I made change to the whole structure of the component. And what I can say is that I can add more modifiers as a component, which is really neat because I don't have to pass variables like in React, for example. And I can also move those modifiers in the same order because the order is super important. If you look at the back card, we have the frame first, and then the background color, the corner radius, which clips the content, and the shadow. Now, if I put the shadow before the corner radius, and you don't have to follow me on this one, you can see that there's no longer a shadow because the corner radius is clipping the shadow. So there's a logic to it. It takes some time to get used to this, but it's going to start making a lot of sense as you get used to it. But that is just to show you that the order of the modifier is super important. So I have my back card view component, and I would like to use the offset modifier as part of a unique modifier rather than something that every single card is going to have that offset. So I can always just cut this part. So Command X to cut it. As a result, there's no longer an offset in that back card view, and I can just paste it here as part of this component. And as a result, I can reuse this back card view component with different offset modifiers. So now I can just copy this, put another one, set the indentation, and for this one, so the first one, I'm going to put to -40 instead. So now you can see that I can reuse these components, and I can reuse the modifiers or put new modifiers on top of the existing ones that comes with the component, and I can just mix and match. It's really, really flexible in SwiftUI. Another thing that I want to mention is that the first card is in the back and the last card is in the front. So this is the opposite of design tools like Figma and Sketch, and it's really important to keep in mind so that you know at which order the elements in front versus the elements in the back. Now I want to show you the effects. We have multiple effects such as blending mode, rotation, scale, and so on. We're going to start with scale, and let's apply that to the back card view. And we're going to go to modifiers, look for scale, is this one, and here I can set it to 1.0 or I can set it to 0.9. So now it's setting to a scale of 90% or 0.9, and I can just copy and paste this scale effect to 0.95, and now I have a really nice effect. Since I'm using scale now, I would like to make the back card view to have the same width by default as the front one. So what I can do is change the component itself and command click this, go to jump to definition. It's going to automatically jump to that piece of code that controls that component. And I'm going to set it to the same width, which is 340. And so now I have exactly this, and exactly the effect that I want. So now I can just scroll back up to continue. What about rotation? So I'm gonna set rotation from the modifier. We have different rotations, 3D, hue, and rotation. I'm gonna select the third one. And here I want you to take a look at the detail of each of these modifiers because they have documentation. And one thing to note is the kind of value that it is expecting. Sometimes, like rotation, for example, is going to give you some weird value and you don't know what to do next. So you can definitely take a look at the documentation and you can find that it is expecting an angle value. So let me double click this and you're going to see here it says .0, but it's not clear what you can do with it. Of course, you can do dot and you can find the option, or you can just put whatever it is expecting, which is in the documentation, angle, parentheses to get to the values, and it's gonna be of type degrees. A double is basically a number, and we're gonna set to the degrees for the rotation effect. In this case, it's going to be 5. And I could also have done the other way, which is with a dot. So I'm going to go to the other back card view, search for rotation again, double click rotation and do dot and choose one of the options. And here it is of type angle with degrees and set it to 5. So this is 2 ways to write the same things, and it's all explained in the documentation if you're confused. But essentially what it means is that in Swift, you can omit the type itself and just type dot and go directly to the property of that value. This is a shorter way of writing this because it already knows that it is expecting angle. And another way to look at the documentation is to do option click on any code such as the modifier, and you're gonna find similar documentation. You can see, okay, so it's rotation effect and it is expecting angle of type angle. And so when you know that it is expecting angle, you can just type angle or just dot to get to the property of that value. Now, don't worry if you don't understand everything, you're gonna get used to it, but I just wanted to show you that you can check the documentation and check what kind of value that it is expecting. Okay, so now I'm gonna put degrees 10 and I have this. I'm also going to add a 3D transformation on the back card here. Search for 3D. Oftentimes, it's gonna give me all of those default values and I can just double click it and play with those values. So, for example, this 3D transformation is a little bit too sharp. So what I can do is set it to, let's say, 30, and you can control on which axis that it is applying the 3D rotation. So if you want to set it to just X and Y, you can do it like this, and it's going to look like what you see here. And you want to use only the Y or the X, you can disable one or the other. In this case, I'm going to disable the Y and set it to 0, and the Z set it to 0. And I'm going to set the degrees to 5 for this one. Copy and paste this modifier for the other back card and set this one to 10. Next, we can take a look at blending mode. And this is really interesting because blending mode is getting more and more powerful nowadays, especially in design tools, in CSS, but also SwiftUI. You can use blending mode and it's very common now. It makes your design a little bit more interesting. It makes the colors pop a little bit more against each other for drop shadows, for example, or in this case, we have a bunch of cards using blending mode to create a level of depth that I believe can be interesting. So we are going to go here after the 3D rotation, look for blending mode. And we have a bunch of these blending modes. What I can recommend is either soft light, overlay, or hard light. Those are some of the most popular ones, and they're really interesting. You can definitely experiment with them. I'm going to select hard light, and I'm going to apply the same for all 3 cards, like this. So that creates a pretty interesting effect. Now the question is, what happens if I want to change the background? Should I go to the component and change the color here? Or should I do some other trick? Well, what I can tell you is that components are generally useful for what is here, not here, usually. So this part, you can definitely decide to just bring it outside of the component so that you can customize them. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna bring the back card view, these 3 modifiers called background, corner, radius, and shadow, and cut them, Command X, and bring them to each of these, but in a correct order, because this is the card and it should be before the offsets. And if you want to set the indentation, you can set Command and I while selecting on a code. This is going to auto indent. If you want to do manual indentation, you can Command left bracket and right bracket to move left and right. So I'm gonna do the same thing for the other back card view and indent this correctly. Finally, I'm going to change the color. So instead of dot blue, parentheses, and the name of the color coming from my assets catalog, I can use card 4, and then I can use card 3 for the other card, like this. Perfect. Now let's just create quickly the rest of the layout. We have this title with this image, and then we have this bottom card that we want to design. So let's go back, and for the title, we're gonna put that underneath everything. So we're gonna start with the text. So text, parentheses, quotes, and we're gonna put certificates. This text you can see is not visible at the moment. We're gonna put this inside an H tag first, Command embed in H tag, and we're gonna push this to the left side by using a spacer. So I'm gonna put spacer to push it. Now you can start seeing it, and if I want to push it to the top, I can use embed in VStack and add another spacer after. So now it should be here. Let's set the styling. So font, set it to large title. Again, use the auto completion. I can also just type it right away instead of using the insert tool, and use font weight, and it's going to be dot bold, like this. I also want to have some padding. So let me add a padding modifier. So by default, it gives me 16 by 16, which is perfect. And lastly, I just want to add an image. I can just insert right here, and I'm going to use the background. So double click here, and automatically it creates the code for me. Now let me create a component out of this. Command click, extract subview. We can name this title view. So the naming convention that Apple likes to recommend is to be as clear as possible, starting with the name, which is custom, and then ending with the type of value. Keep in mind that every single component that you create will be accessible across your entire app. So this name here has to be pretty unique. Otherwise, you can get into conflicts as your project grows in size. And again, we have to resume after we create a component. And now we're going to create the bottom card. The bottom card is going to be in front, so I'm going to have to go and create that after the card view. Generally, I like to start with the content first in SwiftUI, which is the opposite of doing it in CSS, which usually starts with the parent container first and then going into the pieces of content inside. I actually like it this way in SwiftUI because it forces me to keep things light, to start with something very, very simple at first and then growing more and more and then creating components as we go. It's definitely different and you have to get used to it, but it's pretty intuitive. So now we're gonna set a text with double quotes inside. I'm going to copy and paste a bunch of text from the design itself. So right here, we're gonna create this UI, and with the text, I can see it right here. And it's hard to see, so I'm gonna set it inside a VStack first. So embed in VStack, and I'm gonna set a background color. Going to the modifier, and let me set this to white and add some padding. But if I put the padding after the background, you're gonna see it's not gonna do anything because the background is already created. And it's just gonna add a padding without the background. To fix this, again, the order is super important. We're gonna have to put the padding before the background so that it knows the size first and then it applies the background after. Next, let me add some corner radius, set it to 30, and some shadow, set it to 20. And I want to take the full height, so I'm going to use a spacer for that. So now you can see this is our card. We're going to use the offset to push everything to the middle of the screen, just like in the design. So I'm going to use an offset, set it to 0 for X, and then 500 for Y. So now it's just pushing down everything. Let's customize this text right here. We want to center it. Let's set a modifier called multi-line text alignment. And by default, it's going to be left, which is equivalent to leading, or I can set it to center instead. So now it's going to center the text. And I'm also going to change the font. So the style is going to be sub headline, which is 15 point. And like I said, it's generally recommended to use one of the dynamic types. So these presets. If you're not confident with how to use these different things, just use title, large title if it's the biggest title that you have for the screen itself, or body, which you don't need to do at all because it's already set by default. Another thing you can customize is the line spacing. And we can go to the modifier called line spacing. And here it's just gonna add some point value between the lines. I'm gonna set it to 4. And then we can do one last thing, which is the small little handle here. And to do this, we can use a rectangle view. So rectangle. I'm gonna use a modifier, set it to a frame size in the modifiers, set the width to 40, and the height is going to be 6. Set the width to 40 and the height is going to be 5. And all I need to do is to add some corner radius of 3. And then I can also use a modifier called opacity to set it to 0.1 so that now we have this subtle handle. A few things to fix. First of all, the spacing here is a little bit too big. So what we can do here, instead of setting a default padding for the entire stack, we're gonna set dot top of 8 from the top. And then we're gonna add those paddings for left and right to 20. So horizontal and set it to 20. Now this seems great, but one thing you might have noticed is that we don't have any spacer for horizontals, which means that the size of the card here is going to be depending on the content of the text, which is why it keeps moving back and forth between too small or taking the full width. It's important to test, especially against the device that you're using. So by default, it's going to give you iPhone 11 Pro Max, but what I like to use is the iPhone 11 Pro. And here, when I change here against the device list at the top, you can see that this preview is changing to the size of that device that you're selecting here, which is pretty neat. But also you're seeing that there's some spacing problem from the left and right. That's because depending on if the text is 2 or 3 lines, it's going to take a different minimum space. And so one thing we can do, of course, is to set an H tag with spacer on each side, but I don't really like that because it creates a lot of code for nothing. So one thing you can actually do is to set the frame as a modifier, and instead of using the typical width and height, we can use max width colon dot infinity. So this is going to make sure to push to the maximum width by using the frame modifier instead of using a spacer. And then if we want to have space between each element within the stack, either it's a V stack or an H stack, you can use a spacing property. So spacing colon, I'm going to set it to 20. So now it's going to set 20 between each element within the stack. If I have a third element, it would set 20 here and 20 here as well. Great. So let's create this component here and name it by extracting the subview. Set the name to bottom card view. And then now we have to resume again, but at least our code is pretty clean. We have a bunch of components. We're essentially focusing on the modifiers and the effects that I just shown you. And one last thing I want to show you is the blur, because we're going to start animating that in the next session. So let's take a look at blur and set it to, let's say, a radius of 20. So you can see that we have a very nice blur on the title and the image, and we can essentially copy this modifier and apply that to the bottom card view as well. And we have the blur everywhere except the cards. And in the next session, I want to show you how to animate this, and it's going to look awesome. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, welcome to a fourth session of my SwiftUI course. In this one, we're going to learn about animations. So in SwiftUI, you can create really interesting animations with just a few lines of code by using animation states, just like in React. So the first thing is to set the state itself, and we're going to do that right before the body. And here I'm going to declare the state. So commercial A state var show is equal to false. This is a simple boolean that is true or false that is going to allow me to switch between animation states. So with this done, I need an action. So the action is going to be on the main card, which is the card view. So the event that I'm going to use is on tap. So dot on tap gesture, and then here you can press enter. It's going to create the curly braces, and here I can just put my code. And here my goal is to switch between true or false. And whenever a user is tapping the card, it's going to switch between true to false and false to true. I'm going to type show.toggle, which is going to automatically switch depending on the state. So if it's true, it's going to switch to false and vice versa. Now it's going to complain that since I'm inside a function, I don't know if this show variable is local or from the root. So I need to be more specific. In this case, I declared it here at the root level, And therefore, every time that you want to get a variable declared at the root level, you're going to have to set self.show. So again, I declared a variable called show, and then whenever I tap here, it's going to toggle that variable between true and false. So now the last thing we want to do is to apply our animation based on that state. So let's start with the rotation effect, for example. So here we have, by default, number 5. What I'm going to do is to use a ternary operator, which is basically saying if my state is true or false, then show different angle of my rotation. So I'm going to type show question mark, basically asking if show is equal to true, then set to angle of 0. If not, set to 5 using a colon. So this is the value for true and this is the value for false. So that's it. That's all I need to do to set the animation states. I can start testing it, and you're gonna have to resume here because I changed the state, but also I need to make this interactive. Right now, it's not really interactive. I cannot click anywhere. There's no animation. So to do that, I'm going to click on the play button right here, and this is going to start the live preview. And now you can see a different pointer when you mouse over here, which means that this is interactive now. When I tap here, you can see that it's changing the angle of my card. And now I know that it's working. And I can add as many animations as I want in terms of the corner radius, the background color, offset. So let's try and do that with the offset as well. And then we're gonna look into the animation itself. So I'm gonna put show question mark and then set to -200 or else -20 by default. This should update my preview automatically, and when I tap here you can see that not only does it change the rotation but also the offset at the same time. Now let's take a look at animations, because what we see here is instantly changing those states, but if we want to have a transition, we're gonna need a new modifier called animation. So dot animation, and select the first one, and here we can just do dot, and then you have access to a bunch of animation timing such as easing out, linear, spring, and so on. Let's start with linear. This one has no momentum, which means that when I tap here, you can see that there's a very linear progression in our animation. It's very slow as well. So it's really good for opacity changes, rotation, stuff that doesn't really need a momentum. One of the most popular ones is called ease in out. And this one is going to be slower at the beginning and at the end. So you can see that it has some momentum. And you can also add the duration as well. Typically in SwiftUI, if you want to see more options, it's better to retype it and then you can find one within the auto completion. Here we have easing out and easing out with duration. So we're going to select this one and then set to 0.3. This time is going to be a little bit faster. And now I can apply animations to the other card as well. So let's try to do the same for the offset. Show question mark -400 else -40. For the degree, show question mark 0 else 10. Finally, I'm going to apply a different animation timing for the other card. So dot animation dot easing out with duration of 0.5. Since this one is slower, it's going to have a little stagger effect, which is really nice. So when I tap here, you can see that there's a slight delay in the second card because it's slower. Now you can see that because we have different timings on different views, you can create something super custom and even combine animations with any of these modifiers such as the color, corner, radius, shadow, and so on. Let's also do a background color change. So we're going to do show question mark, and then here we're going to set to color parentheses card 4, else color card 3. So now it should be changing the color, and I can essentially copy and paste the background modifier, apply it to the other card to replace that background modifier, and just switch the colors for them. So from 3 to 4, and this one from 4 to 3. So now we have some pretty interesting effect. Now we can take care of the blur. So we have the title view, which is set to 20 by default. We can just apply show question mark. We're gonna set it to 20. If not, set it to 0. So by default, we should not have any blur. Let's not forget to add the animation timing. So dot animation. This time we're gonna use dot default. What is default? Well, from my understanding, the timing is very similar to ease in out between 0.5 and 0.3. And you're gonna see here, it's applying my blur to a default animation. I'm going to copy and paste the animation modifier and then apply it also to the bottom card view. And also I'm going to apply show, set it to 20, else set it to 0. So now I have this UI. When I tap on the card, it shows my animation here, and then it blurs the background as well as the bottom card. My recommendation for those struggling with animation is definitely use default or easing out, because linear can be very boring and very slow. And at the end of the day, you don't want your animation to be too slow and to get in the way of interacting with the UI. Therefore, the duration should be below 1 second, and a good value is definitely 0.3, depending of course on the timing that you're using. But in about 2 sessions, I'm going to dive deeper into the animation curves using basic curve values, speed, delay, repeat, and of course the spring animations. Before that though, we're going to learn about gestures. So what we want to do is to be able to drag this card and have the other cards follow, and then have some really nice interactions along the way. So I'll see you in the next session. Hey there, welcome to a 5th session of the SwiftUI course. Today we're going to learn about gestures, which is really awesome because since the iPhone 10, gestures have become a lot more prominent, and users have come to expect, for example, to dismiss a screen by just swiping down, or to go back by swiping from left to right. The good news is that in SwiftUI, it's never been easier to set up gestures. What used to require so many lines of code in different places, now you can have it almost as easy as the animation state that we've learned previously. So it's essentially the same way. We're going to have to store another state, but this time it's not going to be a Boolean. So let's type state var view state is equal to cgsize dot 0. So what this means is that we're storing a value of type cgsize, which has sort of an x and y position, and we're setting a default value of 0. So the goal is when I drag this card, I'm going to store the x and y position of my drag to this state, therefore using it whenever I want to set up animations later on. Now let's take care of the event. We're going to go to the card view again. Currently, we already have an untapped gesture. We're going to add a new one, dot gesture, and then press enter. And here it is expecting a gesture. We have many in iOS, such as long press, double tap, pinch, etc. In this case, we're going to use the drag. So I'm going to type drag gesture, and you can see the auto completion here. Double click, parentheses. Let me just format my code so that it's easier to read. I'm going to put this in its own line. So before it, press enter, and after it, press enter again. Now I have my drag gesture. The drag gesture has many events, such as onChange, where I'm getting values during the drag, and then unended, where I'm getting values after release. So let's start with onChange. So dot onChanged, enter. And here it has the action, and it's going to return the drag gesture value. And so I can replace this by deleting this first, and I don't need the parentheses. I'm going to write it the shorter way. So curly braces, enter, and this will automatically close the curly brace. So make sure that you have the opening and the closing. For this event, I will receive values. So I can put value in. This is like props in React, so I'm gonna be able to use whatever it's giving me. Now with this value, I'm going to change my state. So I'm gonna type self.viewState is equal to value.translation, which is of type CG size, and that's why I stored the state to be a CG size so that they both match. So what this means is that every time that I'm going to drag, it's going to feed me with the value of my drag, and I'm going to store those values to my state. So now if I resume this and I start dragging, it's not going to do anything at all. And that's because I'm not using those values to do anything. So what I need to do is to set a modifier called offset. And I suggest doing that before the gestures so that it has less lag. Let's set dot offset and use X and Y. For the X, it's going to be view state dot width. So CG size has a width and height, which we can use as X and Y position. And so for the Y position, it's going to be view state dot height. Now here's the magic. I'm going to start dragging, and you can see that my card is being moved at the same time. So the next thing I'm gonna do is whenever I release, I wanna reset the position. But also you can see that sometimes when I try to drag it, it kind of start at random position. So this unended event is going to help with that. So right after onChange curly braces, I'm going to press enter and then put dot unended and delete this curly braces, put a value in after the opening curly brace, and then reset the position of my view state. So self.viewState is equal to .0. Perfect. Now when I drag this and I release, it just resets the position. Now notice that I don't have any animation, so I'm going to add that right after the blending mode before the gestures so that we don't have any lag. Let's type dot animation, and this time we're gonna put dot spring. So now you're able to drag it, and when we release, it has some nice transition. So spring is another animation timing, which is really neat because it has a momentum and it also bounces back. This is something that you see a lot in iOS, and it's also using physics. So the farther you are, the more it's going to have momentum and more it's going to bounce back. The default spring is definitely more muted, therefore you can barely see the bounce back. What you can do is to customize that spring. So I can delete the spring part and type it again and use the response damping fraction and blend duration values. So I'm gonna double click that. And what is the response is it's going to allow you to have gestures at a much less lag. So the lower the value, the less lag it's going to have. So we can set 0.3 and it's going to feel a lot more real time. For the damping fraction, this is the resistance. The bigger the number, the less bounce back you're gonna see. So we can set to, let's say, 0.6. As for the blend duration, I'm gonna set to 0. I'm not too sure what it does, but from my understanding is that when you have multiple animations queued, then it's going to transition smoothly to the next one. But for now, let's focus on response. When you start dragging, you're gonna see that it feels a lot faster, and that's great. You can customize the damping fraction to, let's say, 0.3. It's going to have a lot more springiness. If you set it to 0.9, you can barely see the springiness. Let's set it to 0.6 for now. It definitely takes some time to experiment with values. If you set the response to lower, you're gonna see it's really fast, and it's almost too fast, but at the same time you get better interactivity with your gesture. So I'm just gonna put it back to 0.3 because this is more the animation that I envisioned. But it's important to note that SwiftUI has different factors that really influence the interactivity and the speed of your animation, starting with the order of your modifiers, but also the animation timing and the spring response value. Now that we have the view state that is stored as a state, we can essentially do the same thing to the other cards. So I'm going to copy and paste this modifier called offset to the back card views. So right after offset for each of them, I'm going to paste this new offset modifier. Notice that in SwiftUI you can have as many of the same modifiers as you want, and that makes it really powerful and flexible to reuse your modifiers across your views. At the same time, it would be very messy to reuse my state values to an existing offset that is already using the show boolean to set different offsets. So this is really useful. Now, if I test my gesture, you can see some really cool effect. Additionally, I can even change the state of my show variable during my drag events, such as unchange. I'm going to type self.show is equal to true. This means that when I drag, it's going to open the show animation. And unended, I'm going to set self show is equal to false. As a result, when I drag, it shows the animation, and when I release, it resets the show animation. So this is how you create gestures in SwiftUI. I hope you enjoyed this one. In the next session, we're going to learn about timing curve, delay, speed, and repeat. So I'll see you then. Hey there, and welcome back to a sixth session of the SwiftUI course. Today we're going to learn about animation timing. We're going to try to animate to this view right here, and at the same time we're going to learn how to create the Apple smooth rounded corners. The first thing is to create a state to show the full view of the UI. So I'm going to type state var show card is equal to false by default. Then we're going to make sure that when we tap this card, it's going to switch show card to true. So we're going to go and for card view on tap gesture, instead of setting to show, we're going to set it to show card dot toggle. Let's start with the animation of the bottom card. So we want to hide this bottom card by default. We want to add an offset modifier to the bottom card view in order to hide it by default. Right now, if you command click on the bottom card view, you're going to see that the offset is already there, and we're not going to add a new one on top of this one because it's going to be confusing later on. So we're going to use this one and we're going to move it using Command X to cut it, and we're going to move it right here before the blur. So paste it and set the Y position to 1000 instead. So now it's completely hidden. Then I'm going to set my animation state asking is show card true question mark. If yes, I'm going to set a position of 360, else it's going to be hidden. So 360 is going to show it. So let's test that. And you can see that it animates to the middle of the screen. One thing to notice is that we're using the default animation. We can actually use timing curve this time. So timing curve is not new. You can go to cubic-bezier.com, which is one of the many sites that explain about timing curve. And you have ease in, ease out, linear, and it's expressed by 4 values. You can also change this curve right here. And this is something that you can find a lot in design tools nowadays. And thanks to that, you can easily translate what you have in your prototype in your design tool to SwiftUI. So here you can preview your animation, set a different duration, and when you change this curve, it's going to change the values. Going back to SwiftUI, I'm going to replace default by a timing curve. And here I have the option with or without duration. I'm going to select the one with duration. And these 4 values are the 4 values that we have on the website. So one set of values that I like to use is 0.2, 0.8, 0.2, and then 1. The duration is going to be 0.8. Let's preview this. Now you can see my very custom timing curve that I applied to my bottom card view. Before getting into more animation options, let's animate the title view as well. So let me add another modifier called opacity. Set it to 1 by default. And when I'm showing the card, so if true, question mark, I'm going to set it to 0.4, else to 1 by default. So now it's just changing the opacity for me. I'm also going to change the offset. So dot offset, change the Y position and set it to 0 by default. Then put show card, question mark. I'm going to set to -200 when I'm showing the card, otherwise reset it to 0. So now it's moving my background. Awesome. Let's take a look at the delay animation. I want this background to have a slight delay. And instead of using ease in out with a different duration, I want to use delay. If you remember, whenever we set a modifier, so I'm just going to retype animation, it's expecting a certain value. In this case, it's an animation value. And in SwiftUI, you can use dot notation to omit the value type. So you don't have to write animation.default.easeIn. So you can just omit animation. But when you have multiple values on top of that, such as speed, delay, and stuff like that, you're gonna need to bring the value type. So I'm gonna type animation with a capital A and make sure to select animation of value type. So I'm gonna select this one, then put .default, and this does the same job as before. But now let me just isolate this in its own line. I can add more stuff. So let's say that this is a modifier to the animation value type. I can add more, such as delay 0.1. So having the value type is really important when you have multiple options attached to this value. For example, if I deleted this, you're gonna see an error. So I need that value type in order to add the delay on top of the animation timing. So now you're gonna see a slight delay on this animation right after this one runs. So we have a bunch of options such as speed, and I can set it to 2, which means that I'm going to take any animation timing here along with the delay. I'm just gonna speed it up by 2 times. So you're gonna see it's just twice as fast as before. Then I also have the ability to repeat my animation by doing .repeat. We have 4 options: the number of count manually or repeat forever, which means that there's no amount of count. So let's say I'm gonna set it to count of 3, and it's just gonna do it 3 times. By default, it's going to auto reverse. So I can change that by going to repeat count, and then get the option for auto reverses. Let's set to 3 again and auto reverse to false. So you're gonna see that instead of transitioning back and forth, it's just going from point A to point B and back to A to B again. If you don't want to have a specific count of repeat, we can do repeat forever. Again, with the option auto reverse true or false. So it's just gonna do it forever. All right, so this is a little bit too jumpy. What I'm gonna do is comment out repeat forever as well as speed. You can do so by doing command / and it's going to disable this while keeping the code. This is especially useful when you don't want to lose reference to that code, but this code is not doing anything at all. Commenting is also great for setting instructions for the next person who's coding or for yourself later on. Alright, so let's deal with the rest of the animations. We're gonna maximize this card as well as these back cards. But first of all, we're gonna set the smooth rounded corners for these cards. So let's go to card view, and for card view, we're gonna jump to definition. We're gonna bring these modifiers so that we can animate them as well. So I'm just gonna put all of them out of the component. So command X and then go back to card view and command V. Here I'm going to indent it. For the smooth corners, I'm going to comment this first. Now it's just gonna be square and it's not going to clip it because corner radius actually clips the content. I'm going to use a modifier called clip shape. And here it's expecting a shape. This can be a circle, rounded rectangle. I'm gonna use rounded rectangle, parentheses, and I have a bunch of options such as the corner radius as well as the style, which is really important. So I'm gonna select this one, set the corner radius by default to 20, and the style, I'm gonna set a dot continuous instead of circular. And that is the smooth corners that you see in iOS. Let's animate the smooth corners. So we're gonna set show card question mark. If true, set to 30, else to 20. For the frame, I'm going to change by typing show card question mark 375, else 340. Let's give it a try. So now you can see that it's expanding the size. All I need to do is to move it a little bit up so that I have exactly like in my design. Let's add a new offset modifier. So dot offset, set Y colon and show card question mark to -100, else don't change it. So I'm gonna set it to 0. So now it's moving my card as well. Let's do the same with the back cards. Let's take a look at the definition. We can see that we can animate the frame as well, so we should take it out of the component. So I'm gonna cut this part, so the frame, and put it outside of the component so I can customize it in my animations. So I'm gonna do that for both of these back card views. But first, let's deal with the offsets because that's the most visible thing. We're gonna add a new modifier because we have a bunch of values already, and we're gonna put dot offset parentheses, set Y position colon, show card question mark -140, otherwise 0. This is going to move the second card. I'm going to copy and paste the same offset modifier to the other back card view. This one is going to be pushed by -180 instead. We have to deal with the rotation so that it looks like the design. Since these cards are rotated by default because of this modifier, we're going to have to cancel that by adding another rotation effect. So dot rotation effect, type angle, parentheses, set degrees, and we're gonna set it to -10 to cancel this 10 right here. We're gonna put show card question mark, then -10, otherwise 0. So this is going to make it straight. Let's copy and paste this new modifier to the other back card view right after rotation effect, like this. But this one is 5, so I'm gonna have to cancel with -5. Pretty good. Let's also reset the scale. So show card question mark to 1 else 0.95. And let's do the same for the other one. Show card question mark to 1 else 0.9. Finally, we can disable the rotation 3D effect whenever we show card. So we're gonna do show card question mark 0 else 10. And let's do the same as well for the other one. So show card question mark 0 else 5. So by doing that, the back card is a little bit too big. So we can change the frame here. Let's go to the width value and do show card question mark 300, otherwise 340. And now we have exactly what we have in the design. So in the next session, we're going to learn how to drag to dismiss this bottom card, but also to drag to different positions so that we can anchor them just like in the Apple Maps bottom card. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi there, and welcome back to a 7th session of the SwiftUI course. Today, we're going to learn how to dismiss this full view by dragging down the bottom card, but also we need to be able to drag to different anchors so that we can show even more content from that bottom card. So as usual, let's start with state var bottom state is equal to CG size dot 0. So starting with a 0 value, then we're gonna scroll all the way down to find the bottom card component and then add a new gesture. So dot gesture, drag gesture, parentheses. Let's put this in its own line. And then right after drag gesture parentheses, we're gonna do dot unchange and delete this to have a shorter code with curly brace, enter to close the curly brace. And then right after the first opening curly brace, we're gonna type a value in. Now we're gonna store the bottom card position by doing self bottom state is equal to value dot translation. While we're here, we can also add unended and then delete using curly braces. Now again, add value in and reset the position when we release the drag. So self dot bottom state is equal to dot 0. With the state values being changed, we can just apply those values to the bottom card view. Let's go to offset and add a new offset, this time using only the Y position, and do bottom state dot height. So let's test this. We're gonna resume because we changed the state here at the top, and we're gonna open the bottom card. We're gonna try to drag. As you can see, it is fully working. Now the goal here is that when you drag, you wanna know what position that you're getting so that we can use that value to dismiss the bottom card at a certain position. Now in web development, just like in iOS, you are going to do some sort of a print logs to your console. But here I want to show you a different technique, because showing the logs can be a bit confusing because you can have a lot of logs and you don't know which one is what. So instead, I'm going to create a new text view. So text parentheses, and I'm going to put value for now. You're not going to see anything because it's right here and it's black. So we're going to have to offset it. I'm going to add dot offset parentheses y colon minus 300. And this is my value. But the goal is to get the value from the bottom state dot height instead. So in order to show value in a string, I'm going to have to do backward slash parentheses and then put bottom state dot height. And voila. So this is my value, and this is going to change when I drag my bottom card view. You can see the numbers changing in real time. This is useful if you want to know how to program your dismiss position. So for example, I can say, okay, at this exact point, let's say after 50, I want to be able to dismiss the card. So let's go to unended, and right before setting it to a reset position, meaning that even before we decide to go back here, we're gonna detect if the position is above 50 and then dismiss everything before even going back. So right after value in, I'm going to type if self.bottomState.height is greater than 50, curly braces, enter, then type self.showCard is equal to false. This will effectively dismiss my full view. So I'm going to tap here. You can see that it doesn't do anything if the value is minus. If it's below 50, it's not going to do anything. But if it's above 50, then it's going to dismiss my full view. So now I'm going to try to make it so when I drag this card at minus 100 or less in terms of values, it's going to anchor to this position here, which is about minus 300. Again, right before resetting the bottom state, I'm going to set another if condition. So if self.bottomState.height is less than minus 100, curly braces, self.bottomState.height is equal to minus 300. So if we test this, we're going to see that when we drag to minus 100, it's not doing anything because the line that resets the position is always running. Here it doesn't matter because we're dismissing the card, but here it does matter because we're changing the position of the card, and at the same time, it's also resetting it. So what we need to do is to set an else statement that does else, curly braces, and then put self.bottomState to 0 inside the else statement. Now you're going to see that when I drag to minus 100, it's going to anchor at the right position, and it's no longer going to run the resetting unless it doesn't fulfill this specific ifs statement. But we run into another problem, which is that when it is at this position and I try to drag and dismiss it, it seems to be resetting back to 0 first, which is what this line is doing. So what we need to do is that when we are at full card view state, then we are going to add an offset to the position, which is minus 300. So let's go at the very top. We're going to create a new state. So state var show full is equal to false by default. And then going back to the bottom card, We're going to change the state to true when we reach the anchor position. So self.showFull is equal to true, or else then when we reset it, we're gonna set it to false back. So showFull is equal to false. Then whenever we're dragging, which is during the unchanged event, we're going to add that offset. So let's go to unchanged. At the end, right after we update the bottom state using the translation value, we're going to type self.bottomState.height plus equal minus 300. So what this plus equal means is like saying self.bottomState.height is equal to self.bottomState.height minus 300. It's a shorter way of writing that without having to repeat this value twice. We also need to run this code only when the showFull state is true. Otherwise, it's going to apply it automatically all the time. So let's put if self.showFull curly braces and then put this line of code within the curly braces like this. Now, this offset will only apply when we are at showFull is equal to true. There's another improvement that we can make. If we drag at, let's say, minus 250, it should be resetting to this position. But right now, I have to drag all the way to minus 100 to be able to do that. And that's not optimal. So I want to show you that you can have multiple conditions at once. The condition that we're interested in is this one, where it says, let's show the full card at position minus 300. So we need to run this code only when we're not showing the full card. So we can type end, exclamation point, which is saying not self.showFull. With this, we're adding a new condition on top of the existing one. So the height is not only less than minus 100, but also the state showFull must be false. That's what this exclamation point is saying. But then, regardless of where we drag, it's always going to reset. And that's not what we want. So we need to add a new condition on top of these two. So we need to add a new condition on top of the existing one that says, or when showFull is equal to true, and when I drag to less than minus 250, then please come back to minus 300. So if you want to group conditions, you can just select the code and do parentheses. Now we have a group of conditions, and we're going to add a new condition, which is or, and then parentheses, self.bottomState.height is less than minus 250, and self.showFull, which means that if it's true, then run this code. Let me scroll down a little bit. And just to reiterate, to express the and, you have to type double and to express the or, you have to type double or. So now we have two groups of conditions. One is saying, okay, so if I'm not at showFull and I run this to less than minus 100, it's going to go to minus 300. Or if I'm at showFull and I'm dragging at less than minus 250, then stay there with the showFull is equal to true. Now, please note that this is one way of creating these anchors. I'm sure there are better ways to do it. And also this part is quite confusing, but at the same time, I wanted to show you the power of creating multiple conditions and combining groups of conditions like this. What you will realize later on is that it's pretty common to use and, or, and have multiple conditions. Although it's pretty rare that you're gonna have to combine groups of conditions and it gets confusing, but still, I think the technique is valuable. One last thing is that I wanna have a maximum drag so that I don't see the bottom part of the card, and that's going to happen in the unchanged event. So let's go to unchange, and at the very bottom, we're gonna put if self.bottomState.height is less than -300, curly braces, then stay at -300. So self.bottomState.height is equal to -300. So let's preview this, and you're gonna see that when I go here, I can't drag less than -300. It's always going to stick to -300. And voila, now we have drag anchors. It's very similar that way you can find in Apple Maps and apps like that. So it snaps to different anchors, and it has a maximum drag. And also when you drag to a certain position, it's going to dismiss the whole thing. Now we can just comment out the text so that it doesn't appear in our final app anymore. Great, so this is what we have so far, and we've learned so much already about animations and gestures. In the next session, I want to show you how to use SF symbols, icons, and how to pass properties to your components. I'll see you in the next session. Hey there, and welcome to the 8th session of my SwiftUI course. Today we're going to learn about SF symbols, how to use them, how to customize the fonts, and also how to pass props. If you're designing for iOS, it's important that you download the SF Symbols app, which can be found in developer.apple.com/design, and click on the link to download the SF Symbol app. Once you open the app, you're going to find more than 1,000 icons, customizable in terms of the weight of the lines, and you can browse by categories. And finally, this completely works with SwiftUI. So if you want to use any of these icons, you can just use this name and put that in the SwiftUI code, and any icon found in this library can be used in SwiftUI. If you're designing using the SF symbols with Sketch or Figma, you're going to need to download the fonts. So SF Pro, SF's Compact, Mono, and New York, which are all available as part of SwiftUI without downloading or setting up any custom font, because these are system fonts and they come with all the customizations that you need. So let's take a look at the design. Here, we're going to try to recreate this menu right here. And we're going to be using the SF symbols, and you're going to see how easy it is to set it up in code in SwiftUI without having to export the asset and put that in the Xcode asset catalog. So here we are back to our project, and I'm going to open the navigator using Command O, and here I'm going to create a new screen. So I'm going to right click on contentview.swift and click on new file to create a new SwiftUI view file. So select this one, click on next. We're going to name this one menu view. Make sure to enable the target and create. So let me disable the navigator for now and resume. I should be seeing what I have in code right here. Okay, so let's start with the first text, which is account. So in other platforms such as CSS, you're going to start your layout by creating the parent container first, and then you kind of go deeper and deeper into the content. But in SwiftUI, typically you would start with the content first. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm starting with the account text, and then I'm going to set up the icon next to it. First of all, let's set up the text font. So I'm going to add a new font modifier, so .font. And here I'm going to set a .system. Make sure to use one of the auto completion. We're going to use the fourth one, which has everything. So we have size, weight, and design. Let's start with the font to 20 and press tab to go to the next. I'm going to put .bold. And finally, and most importantly, we have the option to set the design. What is the design? Well, basically, you can set to one of those 4 fonts that you have downloaded. So I can set to default, which is SF Pro, monospace, which is SF Mono, and then rounded and New York. So let's just test rounded to see if it works. And voila, you can see that I'm using SF Pro rounded by just changing the design property. And this is really cool because I didn't have to set any custom font, and I have access to all of the system size as well as the font weights. And on top of that, we also have access to the dynamic types such as .title, large title, caption, and so on. And that would be one of the options when you set system, for example. You don't have to follow me on this one, but you see that you have the option to set the size, weight, design, but also there's another option to just set the style and design. And this one is going to allow you to have, let's say, .rounded plus .title. But for now, I'm just going to set what I had, which is 20, bold. And for the design, I'm going to set to default because I want to be consistent with the rest of the design, which is using SF Pro. Now let's add the SF symbol. We're going to command click on the text and put that inside an H stack. So embed in H stack. And right before the text, we're going to set an image. Let's type image, parentheses, system, and just use the one that says system name, and it is expecting a string. So within the string, I'm gonna go to SF symbol and find one of these icons. The one I'm gonna search for is gear. And here I have the name. I can of course manually type that, or I can go to edit and copy name. And so going back here, paste the name, and voila, we have our icon. Now, what is interesting is that we can also use the font modifier for the SF symbol. So I'm going to put .font, parentheses, .system, and I'm going to use the same options. So the size is going to be 20, the weight is going to be .bold, and the design, I can delete it if I don't need it. So I would just have weight. And also, if I don't set any design, then it's going to default to SF Pro. Now you can see that my icon is slightly bolder, and this is representative of if you select the bold value for SF Pro text, and now they're both consistent. But in this case, I'm gonna set it to light instead. So just like that, I was able to change the line weight of my icon. Next, I can also set the image scale. So image scale, and I can set it to large, medium, or small. The large is definitely more detailed. Medium is normal, and small is for small icons. So I'm gonna set it to large. And then if you want to add spacing between the elements within a stack, you have to add parentheses and then spacing, colon, let's say 16. Now I'm ready to set up multiple rows of these menu items. So I'm going to put that within a VStack. So command click HStack, embed in VStack. And now since we have a parent container, I can finally create a component. So command click HStack and then extract subview. I'm going to name this one menu row. After that, since we're creating a component, make sure to resume your preview, and we can just jump to the menu row and add props. So we're gonna have a bunch of variables making this component customizable. So right before body, we're going to set a variable. So var title colon string. When you don't set a default value, this means that your component is going to require a value for title if I'm using that component. Otherwise, it's going to give me an error. So before dealing with that error, we're going to set a new variable for icon and set that as a string as well, because if you look at what we have here, we want to replace these two values because that's what we want to customize, the icon and the title. If you don't want to make these values required, then you would have to set a default value. But if you set a default value like this, like an empty value or a gear value, then you might run into an issue where your default value is not optimal, especially before loading an API, for example. And also when you set default values, it can add a lot of code, which is unnecessary. So for now, I'm just going to delete the default value. I'm only going to set the type of value that I require for each of these props. So now that I have this, I can just replace the manually coded values for SF symbol and title. So this one is going to be icon, and the next one is going to be title. Again, we're still complaining here. It's not going to run my code because when I set up my component, these props have nothing. For simple things like these, Swift is very good at recommending a solution. So in this case, you're going to see that it's going to recommend me to add a title. If I run again, it's going to recommend me to add the icon as well, because these values cannot be empty and they don't have defaults to fall back to. So I'm going to have to set a title, so account for the first one, and then gear for the icon. So I'm going to copy and paste this menu row and do it 2 times. For the second, I'm going to set billing, and the icon is going to be credit card. For the third one, I'm going to set assign out. The icon is going to be person.crop.circle. Again, feel free to use any of the icon from SF symbols. You have access to more than 1,000 of them. Now let's align our icons properly. The first thing is, since the default frame of the icons can vary, we should add a frame, and that's going to make everything more consistent. So frame for image, and we're going to set a width of 32 and a height of 32. Also, we're going to make sure that the text is going to have a fixed frame so that regardless of how much text you have within that frame, it's going to align to the left and align with each other. So I'm going to go to the text and add frame, set to width of 120, comma, and then set alignment to leading. Aligning within a frame is really powerful. It gives you even more control over your layout. I'm going to scroll back up and I'm going to add more spacing between each element of the VStack. So I'm going to add parentheses, spacing to 16. Now let's create a frame so that it adapts to the full width of the screen. So I'm going to create a new frame modifier. Instead of putting width, I'm going to put max width to infinity. So this is going to push all the way to the left side and right side of the screen. For the height, I can't mix and match max width, max height with regular width and height. So I'm going to have to create a new frame with height of 300. For the background, I'm going to set background color.white. For the corner radius, let's set clip shape so that we have the smooth corners, rounded rectangle, and I'm going to use corner radius of 30 and the style dot continuous. Then let's add some shadow. Right now you don't see any frame at all, so the shadow is going to help. And I'm going to set the radius to 30. Now you can see that the card is hugging the left and right. What you can do here is to add the padding without having to set a parent frame, for example. So I'm going to add a padding and set it to horizontal, comma, 30. This is going to add that padding left and right after the drop shadow. Finally, let's align our card to the bottom. So we're going to use a VStack as a parent. So command click this VStack and embed in VStack, and then put spacer right before the VStack. So spacer parentheses. And for that VStack, we're going to add a padding from the bottom of 30. So dot padding dot bottom, comma, 30. So this is what we have so far. What is missing is having the avatar, but this one has to be overlaid on top without being clipped. And then I'm going to show you how to use gradients and also color literals in the next session. So I'll see you then. Hi, welcome back to the 9th section of my SwiftUI course. Today we're going to learn about color literals, which is one of the best things about SwiftUI. First of all, I'm going to show you how to create a gradient, how to set up multiple backgrounds to create this effect without having so many containers. And on top of that, we're going to learn how to use an overlay so that this element here is not going to be clipped by the rounded corners. Let's start with the background property. Right now we have it in white, and what you need to know is that background can be anything, any view at all. And in Swift, the color itself is considered a view. So that's why we had to specify the color value type and not just put dot white, because we can have any type of view as a background. For example, a gradient is a view. So I'm going to replace everything inside this parentheses, and I'm going to put a gradient. And to do that, I'm going to do Shift Command L to search for a gradient in the first tab. And here we have many gradients such as angular, linear, and radial. I'm going to use linear, and you can see we have some default colors going on. And then we have the direction from and then to. So right now, let's start with that. Leading mean left and trailing mean right. So we can also put dot top, so that would be from the top, and put dot bottom, so from top to bottom. And then we're going to look at the colors. What I want to show you now is how to use a color literal. So what this means is that we're going to be able to use a color picker directly in the code. Instead of setting dot red or any of the preset color, I can just use parentheses. And within the parentheses, I'm going to type color lit. And when you do that, you're going to have one of the options in your autocompletion that says color literal. So I'm going to select that, and boom, I have a color picker. So from here, I can double click on this, and then I have like access to a bunch of preset colors. I'm going to leave this one to white, and for the second color, I'm going to delete dot blue again, set parentheses, do autocompletion for color literal, and enter. Here, I can select any of these colors, but I can also go to the Mac color picker, which is really interesting. So when you click on other, you're gonna find this little color picker here, and I can go to sketch, find whatever color that I want, and get the hex color code. So let's say this is the hex color code, and it can be any color code that you want. Going back here, make sure to go to the second tab, so these sliders right here, and make sure to select RGB sliders. And when you do that, you have access to the hex color code, which you can just pass that hex color code and press enter, and it's going to get the colors from Sketch or Figma. So this is how you set up a gradient. You can have as many colors as you want, since this is part of an array that's expressed by these square brackets. And here you don't have to follow me on this one, but if I was to add more colors, I would just copy from the comma to the color after the parentheses. I might just copy and paste that, and now you're gonna find more colors. And just to test it out, you can see that I have multiple colors added to my gradient. Let me just go back to my previous steps by doing Command Z multiple times, because that's not part of the design. So now let's create the avatar. But let me explain what I have to do. If I was to create the avatar within the VStack and I was to use offset to get outside of the bounds of the frame, it's going to be clipped because clip shape is doing its job. And the same would be true for corner radius. So instead of doing that, what I need to use is a modifier called overlay. So dot overlay and parentheses. And here I can enter any view. This is just like a background modifier. So I can just delete whatever is inside, and let me just isolate the code within the overlay modifier, and let me add a new view. Let's do Command Shift and L to bring an image, and let me double click the avatar. This is my image, and you can already see that because it's an overlay, it's not being clipped by the clip shape. First of all, I'm going to make this resizable so that it can be smaller, and I'm going to set the aspect ratio. So let's go to the modifiers, aspect ratio dot fill. So that's fine. And then I'm going to add a frame. The frame is going to have a width of 60 and a height of 60. And then I'm going to clip this one as well, dot clip shape. And instead of using a rounded rectangle, I'm going to use a circle, parentheses. So this is going to clip my content within a circle shape. Let me just arrange the indentation first and push this avatar by using dot offset the Y position to -150. Like this, the avatar is being outside of the bounds of the frame. Next, I'm going to set the text underneath. So it's going to be a text element within the VStack before menu row, and I'm gonna set text, parentheses, quotes, mang dash, and then 28% complete. The font style, so dot font, is going to be dot caption. Next, I want to show you how to create these multiple containers by just using modifiers. Going back to our code, right after the text, we're going to add a color dot white. So what is happening here is that since color is also a view, we can just use that as any element like text or a component. By default, this color here is taking the maximum width and height. So we're going to set a frame, so dot frame, with a width of 38 and a height of 6. Then we can add corner radius of 3. And then we can create a new frame. This time is going to have a width of 130 with a height of 6. And then we can add a background color. It's going to use a color literal, so color parentheses, color lit, and we're gonna find one for color literal. And here I can use, let's say, black, but also on top of black, I can use opacity. So dot opacity with an opacity of 0.08, for example. And then I can add another corner radius of 3. So let's see what we have so far. We have the little slider within another frame, and both have corner radius and their own colors. This is pretty awesome. I didn't have to use any more parent containers such as a VStack or HStack, and everything just happens here. For the little white thing, I can align that to the left by adding an alignment after the second frame. So alignment and then do dot leading. So this will align my element. And now I can add more containers, but first, this one is going to have some padding. And if I don't put any number, it's going to default to 16. And then I'm going to set another frame, this time with a width of 150, comma, height of 24. Let's add another background, and it's going to be color dot black dot opacity 0.1. And it's going to have a corner radius of 12. So this is what we have so far, and we managed to recreate this design without having to have so many containers and so much code. At the beginning, it's definitely a struggle to understand the ordering of the modifiers. But as you practice with frame, corner radius, background, one after another, it's going to start to click. And this is one example of that. Before we go, I just want to set a custom drop shadow, because if you set it to just radius, it's going to use a default drop shadow, which is nice, but sometimes we want something a little bit more custom with more elevation, as you can see here. So let's go back to our VStack card where we have a shadow of 30, and let's retype shadowed. And here we're going to have more properties such as color radius, X and Y. So let's select that one and let's use color.black.opacity with parentheses to 0.2. The radius is going to be 20, X 0, Y 20. So now you can see that the drop shadow is pushed downwards a little bit more, making the card kind of floating up more. It's going to look a lot better with actual content. The other thing is, feel free to customize all of the colors that you have so far using Color Literal. It's really quick and it's very customizable. For example, these icons should be a certain blue. So I'm gonna go to that icon right after frame for image. I'm going to add dot foreground color and type color parentheses color lit and find the auto completion. I'm going to paste a custom hex color code such as this one. This is from my design. Feel free to use your own colors. So in the next session, I want to show you how to animate between screens. So for example, we're going to design a little bit of this, and when we tap on the profile, it's going to show this little card on top, but also it's going to minimize this full screen into a small screen while sharing a root background. So I hope to see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome back to the 10th section of my SwiftUI course. In this one, I want to show you how to create this screen and then how to summon this menu from the button. SwiftUI is really excellent for creating multiple views that can be summoned on top of each other and using different animations to transition between each of them. So this is our menu view, and we're going to go to the navigator. We're going to create a new view before menu view. So we're going to right click content view, a new file. We're going to name this one home. So home for me is where I'm going to organize and connect all the screens together. Let's minimize the navigator and resume the preview. Here for the text, we're going to put watching, and then I'm going to set the font. So .font, .system, and I'm going to use the font size plus weight. So I'm going to set it to 28. The weight is going to be .bold, and I don't really need the design, so I can delete that part. Then I'm going to put this inside an H stack. Then let's create a button. So Command Shift and L to go to the first tab and find the button. So double click this one, and this is my button. By default, it's going to have a text inside. Now, what is the difference between having a button or just setting a tap gesture? Well, the button is going to have some default behavior, such as when you click here, you can see a little bit of an animation going on. The action itself is preset, and this is kind of like what you put in the untap gesture. And also, every content within the button will be tinted automatically, even images, and we're going to learn how to deal with that. So you don't need to use a text for the button. You can use an image as well. So I'm going to delete the text, and I'm going to summon an image instead, such as avatar. And you can already see it is automatically tinting the whole content within the button. So if you don't want that tint, you can use a modifier called .rendering mode and set it to .original. So this will remove that tint for you. Since image is using the original size of the image that I have in my assets, I'm going to have to resize that. So I'm going to set .resizable, and I'm going to use .frame with a width of 36 and a height of 36. Let's indent this first and set a clip shape. So dot clip shape to circle parentheses. Now let's fix the layout. We're going to add a spacer in between the text and the button. It's going to push everything to the full width, and we're going to add some padding from the left and right. So for the H stack, so it's important that you select the right end of parentheses, and you can see when you select it, it flashes for a second. And that's really useful to know if you're using the right container. So in this case, it's for the H stack. And for this one, I'm going to add dot padding, dot horizontal. And then we're going to put all of this inside a V stack so that we can push the content to the top. So right after the padding modifier, we're going to put spacer, parentheses. For the H stack, let me add an additional padding from the top of 30. So dot padding, parentheses, dot top, comma, 30. So now that we have a parent V stack, which represents the whole home screen, we want to stack multiple screens on top of each other, such as the menu screen. And we're going to need to put everything inside a Z stack so that they can pile three-dimensionally on top of each other. So I'm going to embed this parent V stack inside another V stack, but I'm going to change V stack to Z stack. That's because embed is really useful for making sure that you're not making any code mistake, because one of the hardest things to master is to make sure that your code is inside the right container. And that's funny, but it's true. So now that I have my Z stack, I have my home screen. After the home screen, I'm going to summon the menu view, parentheses. So now you can see that the menu is being placed on top of the home screen. And at this point, all that's left is to set our animation. So we're gonna go to before the body and we're gonna declare a state. So state var show profile is equal to false by default. And we're gonna have to resume after changing this part. Next, we're gonna set our event, and usually we use on-tap gesture, but in this case, we have a button that comes with the action itself. And using the action, I can just put self.showProfile.toggle. And then we're going to toggle our menu view. So right after menu view, set a new modifier called .offset. We're gonna change the Y position. So Y colon, show profile, question mark, set it to 0 if it's active, if it's true. Otherwise, set it to 600. So if we try this, it's just gonna toggle the menu, but there's no animation yet. Let's add the animation to the menu view. So dot animation, dot spring, and we're gonna use the second option with the response and damping fraction. Set it to 0.5 for response, 0.6 for damping, and blend duration to 0. So now we have a bouncy animation. Okay, so now we have to set two backgrounds. The first one is the background for this screen, otherwise it's transparent. And the second one is the background for the root of every screen. First of all, let's set the background for the root. So right before the V stack, I'm going to do color, parentheses, color lit for literal. And in here, we can set it to light gray. So the second option after white. So what you're noticing is that by default, every single piece of content, including the color, is going to be within the save area. The save area being the space outside the nudge and the home indicator. If you want to disable that, you can do so by using a modifier called .edge ignoring save area and set it to .all. Now previously I used to apply this modifier to the parent container, which is a Z stack. But what I figured out is that it's better to have its own layer and apply that specifically to each view instead of setting it to the parent, which is going to apply to every subviews. Since not every single view needs to ignore the save area, it's better to be specific to the backgrounds, for example. So now that I have the root background, I need to set a background for my home screen as well. Otherwise, it's just going to be transparent. So I'm going to go at the end of the VStack right here. I'm going to add .background and set it to color.white. And this home screen, since it also has a background, needs to ignore the save area. So we're going to add that. So edge ignore save area set to all. But now you can notice that we have a problem with the padding. Because we're ignoring the save area, the content starts from here instead, and that's the problem. We have to manually add a padding. So before background white, we're going to add dot padding set to dot top, comma 44. And 44 is the size of the top status bar. And this padding here is why it's dangerous to have ignore save area everywhere, because this is manual and it's not adaptive, which means that on the iPhone 8, which does not have a notch, you have to remove this using a condition. But this is a problem that we're going to fix later on. For now, I just wanted to show you the problem so that you understand it and learn to avoid it, so that you can use this technique with a background specific with ignoring save area instead of applying it to the parent container, which applies to all its children. Let's move on to the animation. First of all, we're going to start with the scale effect. So right before edge ignoring save area, we're going to add a new modifier called scale effect. And we're going to set it to show profile question mark 0.9 when it's active, else 1 by default. So when we do this, it's going to animate the screen for home. Let's copy and paste the animation for menu view and bring it after scale effect. So now it's going to have a bit of animation. While we're here, let's add a new clip shape modifier and set it to rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 30 and the style dot continuous. Add a bit of drop shadow, so dot shadow. It's going to be custom. It's going to be color dot black dot opacity. Set it to 0.2 and set the radius to 20, x to 0, and y to 20. So now we have a bit of drop shadow in the bottom screen. Then we can add a 3D effect. So Command Shift L, we're gonna go to modifiers, search for 3D, and find 3D rotation. For the angle, I'm going to set show profile question mark -10 if active, otherwise it's going to be 0. And for the axes, I'm going to set Y0 and Z0. Now we're going to have a little bit of 3D rotation, which is pretty cool. Lastly, let's move everything up a little bit by using the offset. Usually I put the offset before the effects. So right before rotation effect, I'm going to set dot offset and set Y colon show profile question mark -450, otherwise 0. And that's what we have so far. We managed to summon a new screen on top of an existing one and do some really neat animation with a root background ignoring the save area to create some pretty interesting screen transitions. Now, please keep in mind that this animation is really customizable. You can make this menu view come from the left, from the right, from any direction, and the 3D effect can have different axes and degrees. So please have fun with the modifiers, with the animation, with the colors, to see what's possible with SwiftUI. In the next session, I want to show you how to drag and get the value in real time so we can apply to the 3D transformation for this screen. And also we're going to learn a simple technique to tap on the background to toggle between the two states. So I'll see you in the next session. Hey there, welcome to the 11th session of my SwiftUI course. Today we're going to learn how to set a simple background so that we can tap on it and switch between animation states. But also we're going to learn how to do a drag progress so that we can drag this card here and it's going to affect the 3D transformation in real time. Let's start with the background. I'm going to scroll down to the menu view and then I'm going to set a background modifier. So dot background and set it to color dot black dot opacity. And here we can set it to 0.1 for now. You're gonna see the background, which means we didn't push it enough. So we're gonna have to put it at 1000, for example. And now we're good. When we press here, we see the background being on top of the home screen. So the goal here is to make it transparent enough, but still present so that we can interact with it. If we set it to opacity 0, it's not interactive at all. So we have to set it to 0.001 and it's not visible at the moment, but it's interactive. So after that, at the end of menu view for modifiers, we're going to add dot on tap gesture. And here we can do self.showProfile dot toggle. Now if I press here and I tap the background, it switches back and forth. If I was to set it to opacity 0, you're gonna see that this is not interactive at all. So that 0.001 allows me to not see it but still make it interactive. So that's a neat trick that I picked up along the way. Now let's deal with the drag progress. We're going to set a state for the view state first. So state var view state is equal to cgsize.0 by default. Then make sure to resume, and then we're going to scroll at the bottom to add a new gesture. Make sure to do it after the end of the curly braces and put a dot gesture and type drag gesture parentheses. Let's indent this and then put the gesture in its own line. Add unchange event, delete so that we can have a shorter code with the curly braces, value in. As usual, self.viewState is equal to value.translation. Then we're going to add dot unended with curly braces and also add the value in. This time we're going to set a reset, so self.viewState is equal to .0. So this is the basic gesture modifier, and we're going to set the offset so that we can start dragging it visually. So dot offset y colon and then viewState dot height. So now we should be able to drag our little card here. Next, we're going to be making sure that we can dismiss the card by detecting the position. So if self.viewState.height is greater than 50, curly braces, self.showProfile is equal to false. So with this, you should be able to drag, and then once it's at the bottom, it's going to have this very satisfying pull. Let's take it up a notch. Now we know that we're storing the view state, and we can essentially use that value in real time to influence some animation. Luckily for us, that value is pretty easy to understand. It's just the position Y or X, but in this case it's Y. And you know, if you pull it to, let's say, this much, it's going to have about 50. So let's test that value and put that right here when it is showing the profile. So what we can do here is to replace the -10 by viewState.height. But it's going to complain because the value that I'm expecting is of type double and the value that I'm giving is of type CGFloat. So I'm going to try to take their recommendation, which is to fix it, and voila, it works. Basically, we're transforming this value. So if you want to see the type of value, you do Option, click, and you can see that this is of type CGFloat. But the degrees is expecting a double. So by putting double parentheses around your viewState.height, it's going to transform that CGFloat into a double. Okay, so let's try this. I'm going to drag, voila, it creates some really crazy angle. And also by default, it's not having that -10 angle. So what I'm going to do is right before the colon, right after the double parentheses, I'm going to do -10. This is going to give me that default -10 degree. And then I'm going to make sure that when I drag, it has less influence on the amount of angle that is being applied. So what I can do is where it says viewState.height, I can divide that number by 10. In other words, if I move by 50, it's going to be applying 5 in terms of angle. So let's see how that looks like. I click here and voila. The animation is a lot less sharp. So that's it. You can basically use the viewState value in real time to apply to any of these animations as long as you know how to transform them, as long as it makes sense for, let's say, the scale, for the offset, and so on. Feel free to use the viewState.height to any of these values such as opacity, corner radius, offset, scale, because SwiftUI makes it so easy to experiment with animation. In the next session, I want to show you how to create components and then bind the states, because right now without components it's getting a lot messy, especially in the home screen, because we're going to have a lot of screens piled on top of each other here. Now the question is, how do you create components and how do you share the states between those components? Because typically it's very complex, but with SwiftUI it's actually very simple. And also I want to show you how to detect the screen size, because having these numbers hard-coded is not very adaptive. So hopefully I'll see you in the next session. So we are at the 12th session of my SwiftUI course, and today we're going to learn about binding states between components so that they all communicate with each other. And on top of that, we're going to learn how to detect the screen size. So let's start with the binding. Here we have a button, and that button happens to be our avatar, which has a state. First of all, we're going to create a component. I'm going to command click button, extract subview, and then name that avatar view. If I command click this, I jump, you're gonna see that we have an error. And that error is that once you create a component, it does not bring also the states. So what we need to do is to create that state. And here before the body, instead of writing state, we're going to write binding var show profile of type Boolean. Now a binding cannot have a default value because this value should be dynamic and shared across multiple views. And when you use a component that has binding, you have to pass the variables. In this case, it's a show profile. So we're gonna go back where we have declared our component, and since it doesn't have a default value, that property becomes required. So we're gonna have to put show profile, and here it says binding bool. We're going to need to pass a state, but instead of a typical state, we have to add a $sign in front of the name of the state, and in this case, it's show profile. So again, there are just two steps. The first step is to declare a binding instead of a state and make sure that we don't have a default value. And secondly, we need to pass that state, which is a binding, and add a $sign. As a result, if I resume my preview, you're going to see that it's going to work as expected. So this is now a component, and it works as if I had that as part of the original view. Next, I want to keep my home.swift pretty light. So what I need to do is to create a new document and put my view inside that new document. So let me open the navigator and right click on home.swift, click on new file. It's going to be a SwiftUI file, and we're going to name that home view. Now I'm going to close my navigator, and by the way, you can switch between the views from this drop down instead. So I can just go to home.swift and then put the code that I want to use. So in this case, I'm going to select all of the VStack without the modifiers and cut that, replace it with home view parentheses instead. This will summon the home view that I have, which is right now empty. Then I'm going to switch back to home view and then paste that VStack instead of the text in between the body. So paste that. And by doing that, you're going to see a few errors. The first one, as we've learned, is that we need a binding here. So we're going to have to go before the body and type binding var show profile of type Boolean, just like what we did for the component for the avatar view. Then the second step was that anytime that you use the component, you have to pass the binding as well. So here we're going to type show profile and pass that state show profile. So $sign show profile. Let's try to resume this, see if it works, and it doesn't. That's because there's a third error, and this one is specific to the preview. That's because when we created a new file, home view, this is different from extracting a subview because it also has a preview at the bottom. And this preview needs some default settings. So what we can do here is take a look at the error message. It says insert show profile. That's pretty familiar. So we're gonna click on fix. And I can't really pass a state because I don't have any state to use. So what I can do instead is to do .constant and set it to false by default. And so let me switch back to home, and we're gonna run this again. And now you're gonna see that everything works perfectly. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's very important that we understand how to set binding for components, but also for new views. This really gives you superpowers in terms of having multiple screens that communicate with each other. Most prototyping tools won't go as far as this. And in fact, we can go even further later on when I'm going to show you about environment objects. If you have done Redux in the past, you have all of those powers within SwiftUI, and I believe it's even simpler to use. Before we move on, let me just indent this properly. So I'm going to select all of this code, multiple lines, and do Control I. So that's a lot cleaner now. On top of that, our home.swift can be focused on bringing multiple screens together. And now we have the home view, which is focused on the UI specific to the home screen. Before we go, there's one last thing I want to show you, which is how to detect the screen size. First, let me switch to home.swift and let me scroll at the very bottom, right after avatar view. I'm going to type let screen is equal to UI screen dot main dot bounds. This is going to allow me to detect the dimension of the screen. And by declaring screen outside of everything, I can reuse this across the entire app, regardless if I'm in home.swift, homeview.swift, menuview.swift, it does not matter. And the same is true for avatar view or any other component such as home view, menu view, etc. So let me scroll and find some hard-coded screen size. Let me resume this first to explain what's going on. So when I try to hide this menu view, I set a hard-coded 1000, and this will generally apply to almost every device. But unfortunately, that's not very adaptive because if the screen becomes larger than 1000, it's not going to hide everything. So the solution to do that and to make it fully adaptive, I'm going to replace this number by screen.height. So from now on, I'm going to be able to use a dynamic dimension of the screen instead of hard coding it every single time. And I'm going to be able to use the screen value from anywhere within my SwiftUI project. So that's how you bind the states between components and views in your SwiftUI project. In the next session, we're finally going to learn how to do scrolling and how to repeat content by looping through some data. So I'll see you in the next session. Hey there, and welcome to a 13th session of my SwiftUI course. Today, we're finally going to learn about scroll view. So we're gonna start by recreating this interface here, and we're gonna make it scroll, and we're also gonna make it repeat. So back to our project, I'm going to jump to home view. So currently we have the title inside an H tag, and we also have the button. And we're putting the whole screen inside a V stack, and we're using the spacer to push everything up. So what we're gonna do is to insert something after the H tag. Let's start by creating the card with a text element. So parentheses, quotes, prototype designs in SwiftUI. This text is going to have a font modifier, and I'm going to use .system with the weight as well. So it's going to be size 24. The weight is going to be bold, and the design, I can just delete it. I'm gonna try to put this text inside a smaller frame so I can have multiple lines. So I'm gonna put the frame. The frame is going to have a width of 160, an alignment of leading, so we can align everything to the left. Then I'm gonna put a logo next to it. So let's embed this inside an H stack and put a logo. So I'm going to do Shift, Command, and L, go to Images, and find Logo 1. So the H tag can align all the elements to the top or to the bottom or middle, and the V stack can align to left, middle, or right. And in this case, I want to set my logo to the top, so I can just add alignment, column, dot top. Then I'm going to put this H stack inside a V stack, and that V stack is going to serve as the entire frame. So let's add a new text, parentheses, quotes, 18 sections. And if you want to set everything to uppercase, since this is a string, I can use it with a function, so dot uppercase, parentheses. This will transform the text into all caps. And then I'm gonna add an image. This time is going to be a card 1. So right now we have the V stack, and that's our entire frame. It's quite big, so I'm gonna set a fixed size for it. So for the V stack, I'm going to add a frame modifier with a width of 275 and a height of 275 as well. Let's add a background modifier, and it's going to have a color, parentheses. I have one of my preset colors, and it's called card 1. So with our frame set, we can do the arrangement of the elements. So let me just separate them properly. We have the card, which is way too big now. So what I'm gonna do is to set a limit size. So I'm gonna set resizable first, then I'm gonna make sure that we have the correct aspect ratio. I'm gonna set it to fit. Let's fix this indentation. Then finally, I'm gonna set a fixed frame using a frame modifier with a width of 210. Okay, so let's see what's going on. SwiftUI always takes the minimum size. That's why it's aligning everything to the largest element, which is the image. If you want to take the maximum size of the container, we're gonna have to use spacer. If I'm using a space for HStack, it's going to push horizontally. So spacer, parentheses, and now it should be pushing everything. For the text, since it's not part of the HStack, I'm going to have to either use the VStack and align every element to the left, but if I do that, then the image will also be aligned to the left, and I actually want this centered. So another solution is to set this particular text to have a frame with a max width of .infinity. This will ensure that I'm taking the full width possible. And by default, within that frame, it's centered, so I can add alignment to leading. Like this text is aligned to the title. Then I'm gonna fix the padding. So I'm gonna set a padding to the top of 20 because I wanna keep my 0 padding at the bottom. So I'm gonna add another padding horizontal of 20 as well. Let me also set the title to a foreground color of white, so dot white. And let's add the corner radius, dot corner radius of 30. For the drop shadow, we can use opacity and use the same background color. So we're gonna do shadow and we're gonna use the custom one. For the color, it's going to be color parentheses card 1, so the same as the background color. The radius is going to be 20, x0, y20. And then we can set the opacity for the color. So dot opacity to 0.3. So what you see here is what I call a contextual shadow. It's using the background to reflect to the environment. It's kind of like having a card with a very strong color, and then that color of the shadow is being influenced by the color of the element itself. This is actually what you see in real life. Not all drop shadows are great, especially when the material itself has a very strong color. You can actually find this technique in the iTunes app, for example, on the artwork of the albums. So with this done, we can extract to a component. So I'm going to command click the VStack and extract subview. I'm going to call it section view. I'm going to make sure to resume after that, and then I'm going to loop this. So command click section view and click on repeat. Boom, it creates 5 copies of the same element. So this is a very simple loop that's called for each, and you can double click on the number. You can set the amount that you want. It's going to repeat automatically what is inside the curly braces. In this case, it's a section view. Let me put this back to 5, and now it's time to create a scroll view. I'm going to command click for each, and we don't have anything for scroll view. So you can embed in anything you want. It can be a VStack, so let's do that. I love embeds because it saves me so much trouble putting code inside a container and then indenting properly. So this VStack right here, I can just change that to a scroll view. So make sure to type this properly, and if you click play, you're gonna see that I'm able to scroll within a frame. Right now, the scroll view is taking all available space. Right now, the scroll view is taking all available height. But for the width, since the content itself is smaller, it's taking the minimum size. So just like the VStack, this is dependent on the size of the content. But unlike the VStack, the content is being clipped. So first of all, let's try to enable the scroll, but horizontally instead. I'm going to set parentheses after scroll view and put a dot horizontal. This is going to allow me to scroll horizontally. But because the content itself is spread vertically, this is the result that I'm getting. So to fix this, what I need to do is to embed the for each inside an H tag. What this does is that all of the section views will be spread horizontally, and scroll view, since it depends on the content and we're setting it to horizontal scroll, then it's going to work as expected. So don't expect this horizontal scroll to also set the stacking for the content. The whole purpose of the scroll view is to just set a frame for which you can scroll, and the content is what dictates the layout. So everything depends on the content. If I was to set a vertical scroll, but I have the H tag, it's just gonna do the same problem. So the content is being spread horizontally, but I can enable a vertical scroll. So I'm gonna put this back to horizontal, and I'm going to add some padding to the H tag so that I have visibility on the drop shadow. So for the H tag, put a padding of 30. And then the H tag itself has a property called spacing. So spacing, I'm gonna set it to 30 as well. Since the drop shadow is being pushed down a little bit, I'm going to have to add extra padding so that my scroll view doesn't clip the drop shadow. So I'm going to add a padding to the bottom of, let's say, 30 more. When you scroll, you're gonna see the indicator at the bottom. This makes sense when it's a vertical scroll, but for horizontal scroll, we can actually choose to disable. So right after dot horizontal, I can add comma and then set shows indicator to false. Like this, I don't see that indicator anymore. And I can also align the text to the card. Right now, we have the H tag, which is taking care of adding a padding horizontally and a default value of 16. If I want to add and set it to 30, which is the padding that I have for my card, I'm going to have to add another padding leading, comma, and set 14. So this is how you use scroll view and how to repeat content. In the next session, we're going to make this data more dynamic and unique to each card. So I'll see you then.